Some people love to drive headphones with speaker amps. Well, this amp has been designed like a speaker amp, but specifically for headphones. So does that mean it's going to sound better with your headphones? We'd better find out. At $4,000 US, this is a flagship priced amp from a relatively new brand out of China. There's some snazzy marketing to justify the price, but I wanted to know if the sound matched the story. What makes the Silver Fox particularly unique though, is its many modes of operation. It has 4 different circuits you can select to drive your headphones, so I've tested them all for you across a variety of different flagship headphones and IEMs to see what's worth trying and what you can ignore. Before we go too far, I should mention that there is also a bit of a problem presented by an amplifier like this. So stick around to make sure that you find out who this amp is not going to work for. As you can immediately see, the Silver Fox is a big beast of an amp. It's not a great amplifier if you've got a limited desk space. I've got a huge desk here and I still struggle with it. But having said that, there are a few things about it that do sometimes make it worthwhile. And I'm not going to give the game away completely here and tell you whether I love it or whether I don't love it so much. But suffice to say, there are things about it that have absolutely made it worth having on my desk. And then at other times, the size has been a challenge. Before you make your mind up about whether you'd be happy having an amplifier of this size though, let's talk a bit about what's going on inside and outside the Silver Fox. Just as a reminder in case you missed it in the intro, this is a $4,000 headphone amplifier, making it one of the more expensive headphone amps within the sort of what I would call almost the normal territory. What I mean by that is it's not stretching up into the stratospheric territory of things like an HM1 or a Mass Kobo headphone amp, but it is still a very expensive headphone amp without a doubt. What you're getting for that money is a fully balanced design, and as a matter of interest or curiosity, the Silver Fox here is actually running the exact same MOSFETs as are used in the Enlium Amp 23R, which is a headphone amp and speaker amp that I absolutely love. Specifically for those that care, this is the Exicon lateral MOSFETs. These are a British-made transistor, and they're a really key part of the sound of an amplifier, that being the transistors used. Interestingly enough though, that doesn't mean that the Silver Fox sounds exactly the same as the Amp 23R, as I'll talk about soon. I mentioned in the opening that this is actually a speaker amp designed to drive headphones essentially, and what that means is it's got buckets and buckets of power. The Silver Fox can output 20 watts into a 30 ohm load, and that means you've got about 10 watts on hand for a headphone around about 60 ohms, meaning things like a Hyphen Susvara. So this is absolutely going to drive any headphone on the planet other than electrostatics that obviously need their own energizer, but beyond that it's got absolutely enough power for anything and everything. Where things get particularly interesting though, as I mentioned in the opening, is that it's also got 4 modes of operation. And so if I switch it on for a moment, and you'll hear this lovely click when it switches on. There's a click. I don't know if you were also able to hear the hum that followed it. There's a short transformer hum. While the transformer, I guess, fills with power and sort of settles into place, that hum does go away. It doesn't hum all the time. And then once it's all powered up, you've got this nice yellow display here. It's very easy to read. It tells you everything you need to know. And then from there, through the display, you can actually cycle through 4 different modes of operation. We've got what's called parallel, what's called BTL, a normal mode, and an active G or an active ground mode. I'll explain exactly what all those are in a moment and how they all sound. But the point is that the different modes will give you more or less gain in some cases, but they also change the character of the amp and essentially give you 4 different flavours of sound. The other thing that this amp does to also help to try to control the immense amounts of power that it has is it's also got 3 extra resistance modes, so a total of 4 modes. You've got no resistance and then levels 1, 2 and 3 of resistance. And this is a bit of a questionable design in my opinion. What it's essentially doing is as we move through each mode, it's adding extra resistance to the output. That's going to suck away some of the power and reduce the amount of juice going into your headphones or earphones, but it's also boosting the output impedance of the headphone amp, and that can mess with our headphones, as I'll explain in detail. But I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to some of the key features and functions of this, and that is that it's got lots of power, it's fully balanced, it's got the 4 operation modes plus the 4 impedance modes. And so that means we've got lots to go through when it comes to sound. Before we get there though, let's quickly give you a tour of the device. On the far side here, we've got a pair of 3-pin XLR connectors. That's for those very, very rare headphones that have a pair of 3-pin XLRs instead of a single 4-pin XLR. So this is just one single balanced output here. From there, as we come across, we've got a 4.4mm Pentacon connector for another balanced output. Below that, we've got 6.3mm for a single-ended output. I've already mentioned the beautiful display here. I quite like it. Below that, we've got an input selector switch, we've got our power button, and we've got our output selector switch. The output selector switch is for the different modes that I mentioned before. Carrying on, we've got a 4-pin XLR that interestingly is kind of rotated 90 degrees, so you do have to kind of put your plug in on its side. It doesn't matter, it's just interesting. And then finally, we've got a beautiful control knob. When I say control knob, it's just volume, but my point is it's really lovely to interact with. It's a beautiful, smooth feeling action. It's connected up digitally to the volume circuit within the Silver Fox. And so as you can see, you've got a digital readout on the display of the volume that you're up to. And it's a really wonderful implementation that's beautiful to interact with. It's one of my favorite volume controls I've ever actually used. Now that might sound like a silly thing to say, but I find that the physical interaction with a headphone amp is sometimes just as important, or almost as important, as the sound of it. And that makes the Silver Fox an absolute joy to interact with. Flipping around to the back of the amp now, and that's no easy feat. What we've got on the back of the amp is 2 pairs of RCAs and 2 pairs of XLRs on one side, and then over here we've got a power connection. That's it, that's all it needs. But it does mean that you've got lots of connectivity for a headphone amp. It's unusual to find headphone amps with anything more than 4 different connections, so 2 RCA, 2 XLR, so it's lovely that that's included in here. And so now if we turn it back around again, let's start talking about sound quality. The first thing that I'd say about the sound of the Silver Fox is it's got a sound that's smooth and rich, but not thick in any way. It's got plenty of detail and clarity and texture, but it's all delivered with this lovely sense of smoothness to it. That means that all notes have a sense of weight and body and presence, but there's still plenty of articulation and clarity too. This is still an agile amplifier, so don't think of it as thick or slow or anything like that. It's articulate, it's detailed, it's agile, but it's smooth and a little bit rich at the same time. The staging from the Silver Fox isn't what I would call particularly large or expansive, but everything's really well placed in the stage. The stage has got a good size to it, it's just not this massive expansive stage. And so how I'd really describe it is that everything just sounds right coming from the Silver Fox. It's not an amplifier that you're going to plug into and necessarily be wowed by its technical characteristics. But everything sounds just right, everything sounds like it should, everything's placed where it should and how it should be. And so it's exactly at the level that I would expect for a headphone amp at this price point, but it's not one that you're going to plug into the first time and just be blown away by. It's not like plugging into, say, the Zale HM1, where the first thing you notice is this insane level of detail and clarity. And I'm not trying to compare the Silver Fox to the Zale HM1. They're on quite different levels of technical performance. The HM1 is quite extreme in that regard, in terms of exceptional in that regard. But my point there is that some amplifiers you plug into and you immediately hear what it's doing. It's very obvious. That's not the case with the Silver Fox. You plug into it and it just sounds right. It sounds great. It sounds wonderful. If you go back to a lower priced, lower quality amp, you will absolutely notice what you're missing. But this doesn't kind of smack you around the head with what it's doing. It just does it. It just does it, it just delivers the music, and you just enjoy it. At least I do. But having said that, everything I've described so far is in just one output mode, that being the parallel mode. And so the question of how this amp sounds is a little bit more nuanced than what I've just said. And so I'm going to go into detail in just a moment, but before I do, I should mention this video, so it doesn't get too long, I've split up into 2 videos like I've been doing a bit recently on the channel. And so if you're looking for comparisons between the Silver Fox and some other headphone amps, that one's coming. It's going to come out tomorrow. And so if you want to see me compare the Silver Fox, which as I said before, has been built like a speaker amp, if you want to see me compare that to an actual speaker amp that derives headphones very well in the Enlium Amp 23R, and also to another exceptional headphone amp at around the same price in the Burson Soloist 3X GT upgraded 2023 edition, I'll explain all that tomorrow. If you want to see that, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Of course, if that video is already out, you'll be able to check in the link in the description down below and watch that one as soon as this one's over. For now though, let me carry on and explain to you a bit more about the operating modes and how this sounds in each of these modes. To start off with, let me explain what the website tells you about the different modes and the manual as well. These are in no particular order. The first one is the BTL mode, and that's essentially a regular balanced drive mode where it puts a right positive, a right negative, a left positive, and a left negative out through the 4-pin XLR. When we go to what's called the active ground mode, that takes the left negative and the right negative and puts them into an independent ground for each channel. When we go to the parallel mode, that's just like BTL where we've got the right negative, the right positive, I've just discovered an error in my research and therefore my notes and what I've said in this video, and that is that in the parallel mode, what we've actually got is both of the output channels, so your left positive and your left negative, actually working as positive drive into the left channel, and then your right negative and your right positive are both turned positive, and they're feeding into the right speaker. And that means that the return path, what is often considered the negative or the ground, that's coming back and into the ground applied by the amplifier. But what that setup in parallel mode is intended to do is give you the same benefits of the fully balanced drive mode from BTL and deliver it with less gain applied. So if you've got more sensitive headphones that don't need the power of the balanced BTL mode, parallel essentially is exactly the same, just with less gain. And we'll talk about whether it actually does sound the same in a moment, but that's the theory behind it. And then finally, we've got the normal mode. And normal mode is basically what we're used to hearing as single-ended. It's got a left positive, a right positive, and then a shared common ground for the negative paths. Now you might immediately think, why would you take a balanced amplifier, a balanced circuit, and then output what is essentially a single-ended output circuit through the 4-pin XLR, or indeed the dual 3-pin XLR and or the 4.4mm connections? And the answer is it's all about changing how the sound's presented. So let's talk now about how each of the sound modes performs and which one my favourite is and why. Starting off in BTL mode, and it gives you all the benefits that I described before with the sound: smooth, articulate, agile, detailed, lovely soundstage, not expansive but very well placed, very well separated, and very well structured. The BTL mode has this lovely sense of direct, authoritative delivery of the sound. Not authoritative in terms of being forceful, but in terms of having weight and drive and power behind it. And I don't mean power in terms of massive amounts of power like watts. I mean power in terms of it's just completely under control with everything. As I've already mentioned, the sense of articulation and agility is fantastic. And as we then move over to the parallel mode, which theoretically is meant to sound the same but with less gain, the good news is it's absolutely the same. Once you volume match the two outputs because the BTL mode has a bit more gain to it, once you volume match them, they sound absolutely interchangeable. And that's fantastic. That means you can get the benefits of that fully balanced circuit without necessarily having to worry about not having enough volume range. Now I should mention at this point, because of that wonderful volume control that I talked about before, you've got lots and lots of control over the volume coming out of this, regardless of how sensitive your headphones are. So volume range is not an issue, even with IEMS from the Silver Fox. But having said that, there are a couple of other issues which we will get to soon. Moving now over to the active G mode, and as a reminder, what the manual says is happening here is we're adding some sort of virtual ground type system to the left and the right negative channels. Doing that really kind of livens up the mid-range from the Silver Fox. It makes the mid-range just a little bit more prominent, and therefore it does make the sound just a little bit thicker, but only very slightly. It's not a significant shift in terms of tonality of the amp, but it's definitely a noticeable shift in terms of the points of emphasis in the sound. It brings the soundstage about a half step closer and a little bit inwards on the sides. It's only a slight shift once again, but it's noticeable. And where I found the biggest benefits with active G mode is for female vocals. It says on the Silver Fox website and the manual that that's really where that mode is kind of best for. It's for vocals. And it is good for male vocals, but where I think it's at its absolute best is for female vocals. It brings a certain sweetness, a certain smoothness, not losing out on things like breath and texture, but it just makes the mid-range, as I said before, kind of come to life a bit more. And so where I think it's particularly good is, as I said, for those that love a great vocal performance, and or for those of you that have got a headphone that needs a bit of extra body through the mid-range. A headphone like the original Focal Utopia jumps to mind, where I always felt like I just wanted a bit more body and weight behind it to offset the treble, and that's where this amplifier in that active G mode could be just the ticket. I really enjoy it with the 2022 Utopias, and in fact I really enjoy that sound with all the different headphones. I think it's really beautiful, but it's one of those tweaks that it's going to really suit certain listeners, certain genres, and certain headphones, and the cool thing is you can switch it on and switch it off as you like to. So it's a really nice inclusion having that active G mode. If we then move over to the normal mode, which as I said before is basically like forcing a single-ended connectivity for your balanced outputs, what you get from that, and this is often the case with any of those kind of amps with balanced and single-ended outputs, what you get when you go to this more single-ended style is it actually closes in the soundstage a bit. And the benefit of that is that it actually tightens up the center image. Now I said it closes in the soundstage a bit, I should clarify that. What I mean is it's probably similar in terms of soundstage width to the active G mode. The tonal character is not like active G, it's more like parallel and BTL. And so what you're getting is the initial starting tonality of the amp that I described without the mid-range emphasis, but with a tighter central image, and also for me, a slightly better sense of depth in the soundstage because of that tighter central image. It makes all sounds in the soundstage come across a bit more separated and a bit more holographic to me. Again, it's a fairly subtle shift, it's noticeable but subtle, and surprisingly enough for me, it's actually my favourite. So I've ended up finding that this balanced amplifier, for me, sounds best in that normal mode. Admittedly, I could easily listen to it in all 4 modes, no problems at all. I mean, it's kind of 3 modes because parallel and BTL are interchangeable, it's just the gain that changes. But in all modes, I've thoroughly enjoyed the Silver Fox, but normal's actually the one that I found myself going to the most. It's more tonally balanced than the active G mode, and rather than separating the soundstage left and right like the parallel and BTL modes do, it comes in just a little bit at the sides, but it gives me more sense of depth, more sense of focus on the central image, and I really enjoy it. As I said, all 4 modes are brilliant, but normal is actually the one that I probably enjoy the most. As you'll have seen on screen, none of these modes actually change the frequency response that's being delivered by your headphones. It's just changing the sense of character and emphasis and sort of placement of the sound and the image. And so that's also, in my opinion, quite a good thing because you don't necessarily want an amplifier that's particularly coloured, that's particularly changing the frequency response, but you may want just a little hint of something extra in the sound, and that's what these modes give you. And so now, having hopefully given you a sense of how the Silver Fox sounds in general, let me talk briefly about a few of the different tests that I wanted to run to make sure that you knew what to expect if you've got different inputs, different sorts of headphone wiring, etc. One of my first tests was to check if the RCA and the XLR inputs had any difference in quality, and the great news is that there is no difference that in any way I would call significant. The reason I don't say there's no difference at all is because there's different connection types. That means the interconnects being used, the wiring being used is a little bit different. And so you may find very subtle differences depending on the interconnects, depending on the source device, etc. But the point is there's no significant difference in the output from the headphone amp that would make me think that it's actually altering the performance of the amplifier depending on the RCA or the XLR going in. So you can use it with a single-ended DAC or a balanced DAC and know that you're getting maximum sound quality. While we're talking balanced and single-ended, I also always think it's important to check if the single-ended 6.3mm output matches things like the 4.4 and the 4-pin XLR, and the 3-pin XLR for those that use it. And what I found in going from the 4-pin XLR over to the 6.3mm connection, which by the way, when you're on the 6.3mm connection, you're essentially in normal mode no matter what you do, what I found from the 6.3 was that the soundstage got a little bit narrower from that circuit. It also meant that the central image was a bit more focused, but also a little bit more forward and closer to me, so there was less sense of depth in the soundstage. And normally with that sort of a shift, I generally find myself saying that it's kind of not better or worse, but different. But I don't think that's true in the case of the Silver Fox. I can't entirely put my finger on exactly what the difference was, but as I went between the two, the difference in the positioning of the sounds, so things like the more focused central image, that's not really different from what I'm used to hearing in normal mode from the 4-pin XLR. But what I found was that in any mode that I tried, going between the two, I kept feeling like I wanted to go back to the 4-pin XLR. And so for whatever reason, I do think that the 6.3mm output is a very slight downgrade. But having said that, it's not bad by any stretch. If I had only a single-ended connection headphone, I would still very happily use the Silver Fox. But if I had the choice between a 4-pin XLR or a 4.4mm connection rather than a 6.3, I would absolutely go to the balanced connection just to get that extra little bit of separation and clarity that I think is somehow lost in the 6.3mm. And perhaps it's one of those things where the character of the amp being a little bit smoother, a little bit richer to start with, doesn't necessarily suit going to that 6.3mm sound. And that might sound like a silly comment to make, being a 6.3mm sound because it's a connector, it doesn't necessarily have a sound. But as I've said in multiple reviews in the past, comparing balanced and single-ended outputs from a headphone amp, like say a Burson Soloist 3X GT is a good example, often when you go from the 4-pin XLR to the 6.3, you do get a slightly warmer sound because of that sharing of the common ground, because of the way that changes the presentation of the sound. It's not uncommon for it to shift a little bit, and as I said, normally it's about just different rather than better or worse. But in the case of the Silver Fox, I definitely feel like maybe the combination of the starting character of the amp with the extra bit of, not thickness, but that extra bit of kind of focus or solidity to the sound through the 6.3mm, it kind of doesn't need. So if you can go balanced for this, I recommend going balanced. But it's not to say the 6.3mm is bad, just that the 4.4 and the 4-pin XLR are better in my opinion. Now, as you can probably tell, I haven't done testing on the 3-pin XLR outputs. I have tried other amps in the past that also use that connection. I've never ever heard any difference between the 3-pin XLR, and I mean a pair of 3-pin XLRs feeding into your headphones versus a 4-pin XLR, so I didn't bother trying to hunt down an adapter to do the test. And so at this point, hopefully what you're taking away from this review is that the Silver Fox is a really lovely headphone amp. It's beautiful to interact with, it feels premium and quality, the interface is lovely, and the sound quality, I think, is very refined, very easy to listen to, but very high quality. As I said, it's not going to knock your socks off the first time you plug into it, but it's going to deliver you a very enjoyable listening experience with pretty much whatever you plug into it, particularly in terms of headphones. IEMS we'll talk about in a second. And so things are currently looking pretty good for the Silver Fox, I think, but at this point it's time for me to raise the fly in the ointment. And that is that unfortunately you can hear some noise from the Silver Fox when you're running IEMS or low impedance dynamic driver headphones. And this is interesting, it doesn't seem to depend so much on the sensitivity of the dynamic driver headphones so much as the impedance. So lower impedance dynamic drivers, you hear noise, but a higher impedance sensitive dynamic driver like the Focal Utopia 2022, those seem to be fine. And this is where things get really interesting in the design of the Silver Fox. I talked earlier on in this video about the fact that there's 4 different impedance modes from the Silver Fox. And those are there to theoretically reduce the output power into very sensitive headphones and IEMs. But the problem with the design, and this has been done before on other amps and I don't quite get it, the reason there's a problem is that when you increase the impedance of the output circuit, you start to mess with the frequency response of the headphones and earphones. Now, if it's a planar magnetic headphone or earphone with a dead flat impedance curve, meaning that if it's, say, a 30 ohm headphone, it's 30 ohms at 20 Hz all the way through to 20 kilohertz, that's fine. But the problem is when you get multi-driver IEMs, or you get a dynamic driver headphone, or a dynamic driver IEM for that matter, what you'll often find is that the impedance at one point on the frequency response is different at another. So for instance, if we look at a headphone like a Sennheiser HD660S2, that's going to have wild swings, peaks, troughs, etc. in its impedance curve. And what that means is that when you start pairing it up with a higher output impedance on the headphone amp, you start hearing a different tuning of the headphone. So no longer do you hear what was intended by the people that designed it. Now you're hearing something else and you kind of have to hope that you like it. And so what that actually means is that the output impedance adjustment mode on the Silver Fox is kind of only going to work if you're lucky and you happen to like what it does to the sound of the headphones, or if you're using a planar magnetic and those don't have a problem with noise anyway. In the case of a multi-driver earphone like the T-Audio Prestige Limited, what you'll find is that when you pair it up with a high output impedance, you get this horrible increase in bass that's really not enjoyable. On the other hand, some other headphones, like ZMF headphones, the Focal Utopias as well, what you might find is that plugging into a high output impedance is actually very enjoyable. And so that's what I mean. This is very much going to be a lucky dip thing. Unless you can get your hands on the phase versus frequency response graph for the earphones and do a bit of maths and work out how it's going to change the sound, you're really going into this blind and it's a lucky dip. And so my advice is to kind of think of this as not having that mode at all, and therefore to think of this device as not suitable for low impedance dynamic driver headphones and or for pretty much any IEM. In almost all cases, both of those types of headphones and or earphones are going to show you the noise coming out of the Silver Fox, and then it's going to be difficult to get rid of that noise without causing problems with the frequency response. And so where this is really, really good is with any headphone that's above, it seems to be about 50 to 60 ohms, and I'm talking about dynamics there. So anything that's 300 ohms, 80 ohms, they're all fine. But once you start getting down below sort of 50 to 60 ohms, you might start to hear noise. And then it's also absolutely brilliant with planar magnetics. So keep all that in mind if you're considering the Silver Fox, because other than that issue, it's a wonderful, wonderful headphone amp. I've used it with most headphones in my collection with no problems at all. There's just a couple of outliers that cause problems, like say a Beyerdynamic DT900 or 700 Pro X, because they're quite a low impedance headphone. But with the Focal Utopias, the ZMF Calderas, the Meza Elites, the ZMF Verite Open, Atrium, all of those, it's absolutely spectacular. So it's a wonderful headphone amp, it sounds amazing, it's got a beautiful character to its sound, and so I do recommend it in almost all cases. However, if you would like a bit more detail than that, and you want to know how this compares to some other kind of reference points, then as I said before, make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so that you don't miss tomorrow's video where I'm going to go through and give you the comparisons that I mentioned earlier with the Enlium Amp 23R and also the Burson Soloist 3X GT with all the upgrades applied. I'll tell you right now, it's a really interesting battle with some really interesting outcomes, I think, especially because the same MOSFET transistors used in this one are used in the Enlium Amp 23R. So make sure you check in tomorrow and hear the comparisons, or use the link down below if this video's been out for a while, and see my thoughts on how the Silver Fox compares to those others. For now though, if you've found this video useful and helpful, if you've liked it, please hit the thumbs up button. And until the next video, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.